August 25th, 1944. The fields of Normandy stretched endlessly under a grey morning sky, transformed from peaceful French farmland into the most massive military supply depot the world had ever seen. Mountains of wooden crates, steel drums filled with aviation fuel, and canvas-covered ammunition boxes created geometric patterns across the landscape that could be seen from miles away. The air vibrated with the constant rumble of diesel engines as thousands of trucks, olive-drab GMC 686 Dodge weapon carriers and massive Diamond T tank transporters moved in endless convoys along dusty roads that had been carved through wheat fields just weeks earlier. This was American industrial might, made manifest, a mechanical river of steel and rubber that flowed from the beaches of Normandy toward the advancing front lines with the relentless power of a natural force. German General Günther Blumentritt stood in his command bunker 50 miles inland, studying intelligence reports that seemed to defy all logic and military experience. Allied forces were advancing across France at speeds that violated every principle of logistics and supply that had governed warfare since Napoleon's campaigns. Patton's Third Army was consuming fuel, ammunition, and spare parts at rates that should have ground any offensive to a halt within days. Yet American tanks continued racing toward Paris, the Seine River, and the German frontier without any apparent reduction in tempo or capability. Blumentritt shook his head in disbelief as he read casualty reports, prisoner interrogations, and reconnaissance summaries that painted an impossible picture of enemy forces that seemed to possess unlimited supplies and inexhaustible reserves. The German High Command had built their defensive strategy around the assumption that American logistics would collapse under the strain of rapid advance, forcing Allied commanders to halt their offensive and consolidate their positions, while supply lines caught up with the forward elements. Wehrmacht intelligence officers had calculated that American fuel consumption would exceed delivery capacity within 2 weeks of any major breakthrough, creating opportunities for German counterattacks against overextended enemy forces that had outrun their logistical support. These calculations had proven accurate in previous campaigns across North Africa and Italy, where Allied advances had repeatedly stalled when supply difficulties forced operational pauses that allowed German forces to regroup and establish new defensive positions. But something was different this time, something that German planners had never encountered and could not understand through traditional military analysis. American trucks were moving in numbers and with efficiency that seemed to transcend the normal limitations of mechanical transportation and human endurance. Night and day, rain or shine, under attack from the Luftwaffe or grinding through muddy roads that should have been impassable, endless convoys of vehicles carried the tools of war from the Norman beaches to wherever American commanders needed them most. The sight of these mechanical rivers flowing across the French countryside would have been impressive enough as a demonstration of industrial capacity, but their strategic impact was revolutionizing the nature of warfare itself by eliminating the traditional relationship between advance and supply that had governed military operations throughout history. Could an army of trucks become America's deadliest weapon? The strategic situation following the Allied breakout from Normandy in late July 1944 created unprecedented logistical challenges that threatened to halt the most successful military advance in European history, despite overwhelming American advantages in men, equipment, and air superiority. General Omar Bradley's breakthrough at St. Lo had shattered German defensive lines and created the opportunity for exploitation that Allied commanders had been seeking since D-Day, but the speed of the subsequent advance quickly outpaced the capacity of traditional supply methods to keep pace with advancing armies. Patton's Third Army, activated on August 1st and immediately thrown into the pursuit of retreating German forces, was consuming over 800,000 gallons of fuel daily, while advancing at rates that sometimes exceeded 50 miles in a single day across terrain that had no established supply infrastructure. The logistical mathematics of sustained offensive operations in 1944 were brutal and unforgiving, requiring continuous delivery of enormous quantities of fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, and spare parts to maintain combat effectiveness among forces that were advancing faster than their supply lines could be extended. Each Sherman tank consumed approximately 5 gallons of fuel per mile of travel, while a typical armored division required over 100,000 gallons daily just for basic movement before considering the additional consumption required for combat operations. Artillery units fired thousands of shells during major engagements, each round weighing dozens of pounds and requiring transportation from ammunition dumps that might be hundreds of miles behind the front lines. The scale of these requirements exceeded anything attempted in previous military history. The creation of the Red Ball Express represented a revolutionary approach to military logistics that transformed supply delivery from a methodical, carefully planned operation into a dynamic, responsive system capable of adapting to rapidly changing tactical requirements. Named after railroad terminology for priority freight service, the Red Ball Express established dedicated highway routes between Normandy supply depots and forward distribution points, with civilian traffic banned and military police controlling access to ensure uninterrupted flow of supply convoys. The system represented more than just additional trucks. It was a complete reimagining of how armies could be sustained during rapid offensive operations that covered hundreds of miles in weeks rather than months. The human element of the Red Ball Express reflected both the democratic character of American society and the practical necessities of total war that temporarily overcame traditional racial barriers in pursuit of military effectiveness. Approximately 75% of Red Ball Express drivers were African-American soldiers who had been relegated to non-combat roles due to military segregation policies, but whose skills, dedication, and courage proved essential for maintaining the supply flow that enabled Allied victory. These men drove through exhaustion, enemy air attacks, mechanical failures, and weather conditions that would have defeated less determined personnel, often working 18-hour shifts and covering hundreds of miles daily to ensure that American forces never lacked the supplies necessary for continued offensive operations. The scale of Red Ball Express operations defied comprehension, even by contemporary observers who witnessed the convoys firsthand, as thousands of trucks moved in carefully coordinated patterns that covered hundreds of miles of French highways and secondary roads. Peak operations involved over 6,000 vehicles moving simultaneously, carrying everything from individual rifle cartridges to complete aircraft engines, organized into convoys that sometimes stretched for dozens of miles and required military police coordination at hundreds of intersections and checkpoints. The sight of these mechanical processions moving across the French countryside impressed Allied soldiers and terrified German observers who recognized the implications of American logistical capabilities that seemed to have no practical limitations. American industrial capacity had been mobilized to support Red Ball Express operations through production programs that delivered vehicles, spare parts, fuel, and equipment at rates that exceeded the consumption requirements of armies advancing across Europe at unprecedented speeds. Detroit automotive plants that had been converted to military production were delivering completed trucks faster than shipping could transport them to European ports, while petroleum refineries worked around the clock to produce aviation fuel, gasoline, and diesel oil that was transported across the Atlantic in tanker fleets protected by naval convoys. The integration of civilian manufacturing capacity with military logistics created supply capabilities that German planners had never anticipated and could not effectively counter through traditional interdiction efforts. The tactical implementation of Red Ball Express operations required coordination between transportation units, supply depots, combat formations, and supporting services that represented a masterpiece of military organization and planning. Traffic control points manage convoy movement to prevent congestion and ensure priority deliveries reach their destinations on schedule, while maintenance facilities provided emergency repairs and vehicle replacement to keep the maximum number of trucks operational at all times. Communication systems coordinated supply requests with available transportation capacity, creating a responsive network that could redirect resources based on changing tactical requirements without disrupting the overall flow of essential materials. German attempts to disrupt Red Ball Express operations through air attacks, sabotage, and artillery interdiction achieved only limited success against a supply system that was designed to absorb losses and maintain functionality despite enemy interference. Luftwaffe fighters and bombers targeted convoy routes and supply depots, but Allied air superiority limited the effectiveness of these attacks, while the sheer scale of Red Ball operations meant that destroying individual vehicles or facilities had minimal impact on overall supply capacity. Even successful German attacks were quickly overcome by the system's ability to reroute traffic, replace damaged vehicles, and continue operations without significant interruption. The strategic implications of successful Red Ball Express operations extended far beyond immediate logistical benefits to influence the entire trajectory of Allied campaign planning and German defensive strategy throughout the remainder of the European war. American commanders gained confidence in their ability to sustain rapid offensive operations over extended distances, enabling strategic planning that would have been impossible with traditional supply methods. German commanders, meanwhile, were forced to abandon defensive strategies based on the assumption that Allied advances would halt due to supply difficulties, requiring fundamental revisions to tactical doctrine that had been developed over decades of military experience. The integration of Red Ball Express operations with broader Allied strategic planning demonstrated the importance of logistics in modern warfare and established principles that would influence military thinking for generations after World War II ended. The success of the supply system proved that industrial capacity, organizational efficiency, and human dedication could overcome traditional limitations on military operations, creating new possibilities for rapid, decisive campaigns that could achieve strategic objectives before enemy forces could adapt to changing circumstances. The lessons learned from Red Ball Express operations would inform American military doctrine throughout the Cold War period and beyond, establishing logistics as a decisive factor in modern warfare rather than simply a support function. The convoy stretched for 12 miles along Route Nationale 13, a mechanical serpent of olive-drab steel and canvas that wound through the Norman countryside under a pewter sky heavy with the promise of rain. Sergeant James Washington, a 32-year-old truck driver from Detroit who had learned to handle heavy vehicles in the Ford River Rouge plant before the war, gripped the steering wheel of his GMC 666 and squinted through windshield wipers that fought a losing battle against the August downpour. Behind him, secured under canvas tarps that snapped and billowed in the wind, rode 10 tons of 100 mm artillery shells bound for Patton's advancing guns somewhere beyond the horizon. The odometer on his dashboard showed 47,000 miles since landing in France, equivalent to driving twice around the continental United States. But Washington knew that tonight's run would be one of the most critical in his months of service with the Red Ball Express. Radio chatter crackled through the convoy frequency as drivers reported mechanical problems, traffic delays, and enemy aircraft sightings that had become routine hazards of supply operations in a combat zone. Corporal Tommy Martinez, driving the truck immediately behind Washington, called out over the static, "Red Ball 6, this is Red Ball 7. I got steam coming from my radiator and my engine temperature is running hot. Might need to pull over for repairs." The response came immediately from the convoy commander riding in the lead vehicle. "Red Ball 7, maintain position if possible. We have priority delivery schedules to meet and can't afford delays. Monitor your temperature and report if the situation becomes critical." This was the reality of Red Ball Express operations. Mechanical problems were expected, but mission completion took precedence over individual vehicle maintenance whenever humanly possible. The tactical situation that had created tonight's emergency supply run reflected the stunning success of Allied breakthrough operations that had shattered German defensive lines and created opportunities for exploitation that exceeded even the most optimistic pre-invasion planning estimates. Patton's Third Army had advanced over 200 miles in the past 2 weeks, capturing thousands of prisoners and destroying entire German divisions that had been caught in the open during their retreat toward the Seine River. However, this unprecedented success had created equally unprecedented supply challenges, as advancing American forces were consuming fuel and ammunition faster than normal supply channels could deliver replacements. The Red Ball Express had been activated to bridge this gap, carrying the lifeblood of modern warfare directly to wherever American commanders needed it most. Washington's truck represented one small part of a logistical miracle that was occurring simultaneously across hundreds of miles of French territory, as thousands of vehicles moved in coordinated patterns that delivered precisely the right supplies to exactly the right locations at the moment they were most desperately needed. His cargo of artillery shells would reach the 155th Field Artillery Battalion within 6 hours, just in time to support a dawn attack against German positions defending the approaches to Mantes. Without these shells, American infantry would have to assault prepared defensive positions without adequate fire support, resulting in casualties that could be prevented by ensuring that supply deliveries maintained their precise schedules despite weather, mechanical problems, and enemy interference. The convoy's route had been carefully planned to avoid main highways where German aircraft might concentrate their attacks, instead following secondary roads through small French villages where local civilians often gathered to wave at the passing trucks and offer bottles of wine or home-baked bread to drivers who had become symbols of liberation and American generosity. These encounters provided brief moments of human connection that reminded the drivers why their dangerous, exhausting work was essential for something far more important than military logistics. They were delivering freedom itself, one truckload at a time, to people who had suffered under German occupation for 4 long years. German reconnaissance aircraft spotted the convoy at 2147 hours, approximately 15 kilometers southeast of Caen, and immediately transmitted coordinates to Luftwaffe night fighter squadrons that had been tasked with interdicting Allied supply lines. Major Hans Kruger, flying a Messerschmitt Bf-110 equipped with radar and cannon armament, received orders to attack the American truck column with maximum effectiveness, targeting vehicles carrying fuel or ammunition that would create secondary explosions capable of destroying multiple trucks simultaneously. However, Kruger quickly discovered that attacking a Red Ball Express convoy was far more dangerous than German intelligence had predicted, as American anti-aircraft guns had been positioned along supply routes specifically to protect these vital arteries from enemy air attacks. The first attack came without warning as Kruger's aircraft dove from 8,000 feet altitude, 20 military's cannon shells stitching a line of explosions across the highway just ahead of Washington's truck. The sergeant immediately followed Red Ball Express emergency procedures, pulling his vehicle off the road and into a drainage ditch while maintaining radio contact with other drivers who were executing similar evasive maneuvers throughout the convoy. All Red Ball units, this is Red Ball 1. We have enemy aircraft attacking from the northeast. Execute Protocol 7 immediately and maintain communication silence until all clear signal. Niche. The disciplined response demonstrated months of training and experience that had transformed civilian truck drivers into military professionals capable of operating effectively under combat conditions. Anti-aircraft guns positioned at strategic points along the supply route opened fire within seconds, filling the night sky with traces that created a deadly web of fire through which German aircraft had to navigate to reach their targets. The 40mm Bofors guns and 50 caliber machine guns that protected Red Ball Express convoys were served by crews who had been specifically trained in the patterns and tactics of German night fighters, enabling them to anticipate enemy attack angles and concentrate their fire where it would be most effective. This defensive coordination represented another aspect of American logistics superiority. Not only could they deliver supplies faster than enemy forces could consume them, but they could also protect those supplies from interdiction attempts. Kruger's second attack run achieved partial success, his cannon shells striking 2 trucks near the middle of the convoy and igniting fuel tanks that created spectacular fireballs visible for miles across the Norman countryside. However, the German pilot's momentary satisfaction was quickly replaced by concern as he observed the convoy's response to his attack. Instead of scattering in panic or abandoning their vehicles, American drivers quickly organized firefighting efforts, established security perimeters, and continued moving supplies using alternative transportation, while damaged trucks were being replaced by reserve vehicles that seemed to appear from nowhere. The resilience and adaptability of Red Ball Express operations impressed even enemy observers who had come to destroy them. Washington watched the burning trucks through his rearview mirror while simultaneously monitoring radio traffic that was coordinating the convoy's response to the attack. Wounded drivers were being evacuated by medical personnel who traveled with every major convoy, while salvage crews worked to recover undamaged cargo from vehicles that had been hit by enemy fire. Most importantly, replacement trucks were already en route from the nearest supply depot, ensuring that tonight's delivery schedules would be maintained, despite German attempts at interdiction. This systematic approach to combat logistics demonstrated American organizational capabilities that went far beyond simple industrial production to encompass comprehensive planning for every contingency that might threaten supply operations. The psychological impact of witnessing Red Ball Express resilience under attack was profound for both American personnel and German observers who had expected to achieve decisive disruption of Allied supply lines through concentrated air attacks. American drivers gained confidence from seeing that their supply system could absorb losses and continue functioning, while German pilots reported to their commanders that attacking American convoys was becoming increasingly dangerous and decreasingly effective. The trucks that German intelligence had dismissed as vulnerable civilian vehicles were proving to be components of a military system that was more robust and adaptable than traditional armies that depended on railroads and established supply depots. By dawn on August 26th, Washington's convoy had completed its mission despite enemy attacks, mechanical failures, and weather conditions that would have halted normal transportation operations. The artillery shells he had carried through the Norman night were being fired against German positions within hours of delivery, supporting American infantry advances that would liberate another dozen French towns before sunset. His truck, scarred by shrapnel but still operational, was already being reloaded for another run that would carry anti-tank ammunition to tank destroyer units pursuing retreating German armor toward the Seine River. Radio intercepts captured by Allied intelligence services revealed the growing German concern about Red Ball Express operations and their impact on Wehrmacht defensive planning throughout the European theater. German commanders were reporting that American supply capabilities seemed to have no practical limitations, enabling Allied forces to sustain offensive operations that should have been impossible according to traditional military calculations. Major General Blumentritz intelligence staff was recommending fundamental revisions to defensive strategy based on the recognition that American logistics had eliminated many of the natural advantages that defending forces traditionally enjoyed over attacking armies. The success of Washington's convoy was replicated thousands of times throughout the summer and fall of 1944. As Red Ball Express operations delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies during 81 days of continuous operations. This tonnage represented the equivalent of every piece of equipment needed to supply a modern army of 500,000 men for 6 months, delivered by truck across distances that exceeded the width of most European countries. The statistics were impressive, but the real measure of Red Ball Express success was found in the continued advance of American forces that never paused for lack of supplies, never halted for want of fuel, and never stopped because their ammunition ran out. The strategic implications of Red Ball Express success became apparent as German defensive lines continued collapsing under pressure from Allied forces that maintained offensive momentum despite advancing hundreds of miles from their original supply bases. Wehrmacht commanders, who had built their strategies around assumptions of American logistical limitations, found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to possess unlimited resources and inexhaustible reserves. The trucks of the Red Ball Express had become more than transportation. They had become weapons in their own right, weapons that killed German hopes of victory through the simple act of keeping American tanks fueled and American guns supplied with ammunition. The human cost of Red Ball Express operations was measured not only in the drivers who died in accidents, air attacks, and mechanical failures, but also in the exhaustion, stress, and dedication of men who worked around the clock to maintain supply deliveries that enabled Allied victory. Washington and thousands of drivers like him had transformed themselves from civilian workers into military professionals whose skills and courage were as essential to American success as any combat soldier or advanced weapons system. Their contribution to Allied victory was often invisible to casual observers, but their impact on the war's outcome was decisive and enduring. The psychological transformation of American military confidence following the successful establishment of Red Ball Express operations created strategic advantages that extended far beyond immediate logistical benefits, as Allied commanders gained the freedom to plan offensive operations without the traditional constraints imposed by supply limitations and delivery schedules. General Eisenhower's staff began developing campaign strategies that would have been impossible with conventional supply methods, including simultaneous advances on multiple fronts, deep penetration operations that outflanked entire German defensive systems, and pursuit campaigns that maintained pressure on retreating enemy forces without pausing for logistical consolidation. This strategic flexibility represented a fundamental shift in Allied capabilities that German planners could neither predict nor effectively counter through traditional defensive measures. The liberation of Paris on August 25, 1944, demonstrated the strategic impact of Red Ball Express operations as American and Free French forces advanced toward the city with confidence that their supply lines could sustain urban combat operations despite the enormous logistical challenges posed by fighting in a major metropolitan area. The fuel, ammunition and spare parts delivered by Red Ball Express convoys enabled Allied forces to maintain offensive momentum during the crucial days when German commanders might have organized effective counterattacks against overextended supply lines. Without reliable logistic support, the liberation of Paris would have required weeks of careful preparation rather than the rapid exploitation of tactical opportunities that characterized actual operations. German intelligence assessments of American logistical capabilities underwent radical revision as reports from multiple fronts confirmed that Allied supply operations were achieving previously impossible levels of effectiveness and sustainability. Wehrmacht planners had based their defensive strategies on historical precedents, suggesting that rapid advances inevitably outran their supply lines, creating opportunities for counterattacks against isolated enemy forces that had advanced beyond the range of adequate support. The consistent success of Red Ball Express operations invalidated these assumptions, forcing German commanders to develop new defensive approaches that did not depend on American logistical failures that were no longer occurring. The strategic implications of sustained Allied offensive capability became apparent as German forces found themselves unable to establish stable defensive lines anywhere in France, with every attempt at organized resistance being overcome by American forces that possessed unlimited supplies and could maintain pressure indefinitely. The Wehrmacht's traditional tactics of trading space for time while preparing counterattacks against overextended enemy advances proved useless against opponents who never became overextended because their supply lines moved with them at the same speed as their combat formations. This tactical revolution forced German commanders to attempt increasingly desperate defensive measures that often resulted in the destruction of their remaining reserves. Medical statistics from Red Ball Express operations revealed the human cost of maintaining 24-hour supply deliveries under combat conditions, with driver casualties from accidents, enemy attacks, and exhaustion-related incidents reaching levels that required constant replacement of personnel and vehicles. However, these losses were accepted as necessary costs for maintaining the supply flow that enabled Allied victory, with replacement drivers arriving faster than casualties could be evacuated. The resilience of the Red Ball Express system demonstrated American depth of resources and organizational capability that impressed Allied observers and dismayed German intelligence analysts who recognized the implications of such sustained effectiveness. The propaganda impact of Red Ball Express success provided Allied psychological warfare specialists with powerful evidence of American industrial superiority and organizational competence that could be used to undermine German morale and encourage resistance movements throughout occupied Europe. Stories of endless American truck convoys carrying unlimited supplies to forces that never retreated created powerful symbols of inevitable Allied victory that influenced civilian populations and enemy soldiers alike. German propaganda efforts to minimize the significance of American logistical achievements were undermined by visible evidence of supply abundance that contradicted claims about American industrial weaknesses. The technological innovations developed to support Red Ball Express operations included improvements in vehicle maintenance, traffic control, communication systems, and cargo handling procedures that would influence civilian transportation and logistics for decades after the war ended. American military engineers developed new techniques for rapid road repair, bridge construction, and convoy organization that demonstrated the potential for applying military logistics expertise to civilian economic development. These innovations represented valuable intellectual property that would contribute to American economic advantages during the post-war Reconstruction period. The racial dynamics of Red Ball Express operations created opportunities for African American soldiers to demonstrate their capabilities and dedication under combat conditions, contributing to gradual changes in military racial policies and broader social attitudes about integration and equal opportunity. The outstanding performance of African American drivers under extremely dangerous and demanding conditions provided evidence that contradicted racist assumptions about military capability and courage, influencing post-war civil rights developments and military personnel policies. However, these changes occurred gradually and incompletely, reflecting the persistence of social barriers that would require decades to overcome fully. Allied intelligence services analyzed intercepted German communications that revealed growing enemy desperation about their inability to disrupt American supply operations through conventional interdiction methods. Luftwaffe commanders reported that attacking Red Ball Express convoys was becoming increasingly dangerous and decreasingly effective, while German ground commanders complained that their forces were being overwhelmed by American units that seemed to possess unlimited ammunition and fuel. These intelligence reports confirmed that Red Ball Express operations were achieving strategic effects that went far beyond simple supply delivery to encompass psychological warfare and enemy demoralization. The logistical lessons learned from Red Ball Express operations influenced American military doctrine development and post-war defense planning, establishing principles about the relationship between industrial capacity and military effectiveness that would guide strategic thinking throughout the Cold War period. Military planners recognized that future conflicts would be won or lost based on the ability to sustain complex technological forces over extended distances and time periods, requiring logistics capabilities that exceeded anything previously attempted in military history. The success of World War II supply operations provided confidence that American industrial capacity could meet these challenges if properly organized and employed. The international implications of Red Ball Express success extended beyond immediate military results to influence Allied relationships and post-war reconstruction planning, as European allies observed American organizational capabilities that exceeded their own national resources and technical expertise. The demonstration of American ability to sustain massive military operations across thousands of miles of hostile territory provided evidence of national power that would influence diplomatic negotiations and alliance structures for decades after the war ended. European leaders recognized that American logistics capabilities represented a form of national strength that could not be easily replicated or countered by traditional military or economic measures. The Red Ball Express represented a revolutionary integration of industrial production capacity, transportation technology, and military organization that demonstrated how civilian economic capabilities could be transformed into decisive military advantages through systematic application of American management principles and technological innovation. The success of the supply system reflected more than simply having adequate numbers of trucks and drivers. It required sophisticated coordination between manufacturing facilities, shipping operations, maintenance systems, and combat forces that created unprecedented levels of military effectiveness through superior organization rather than advanced weapons technology. This achievement established logistics as a decisive factor in modern warfare, rather than simply a support function for more glamorous combat operations. The comparative analysis of American versus German supply capabilities revealed fundamental differences in industrial organization, resource allocation, and strategic planning that reflected broader contrasts between democratic and authoritarian approaches to military preparation and economic mobilization. American factories produced vehicles, spare parts, fuel and equipment at rates that exceeded German manufacturing capacity despite facing attacks from submarine warfare, strategic bombing and sabotage efforts designed to disrupt Allied production. The resilience and adaptability of American industrial systems demonstrated advantages of decentralized production, civilian participation, and market-based resource allocation that totalitarian systems could not effectively replicate or counter. The technological infrastructure supporting Red Ball Express operations included innovations in vehicle design, maintenance procedures, communications equipment, and traffic management systems that represented cutting-edge applications of civilian technology to military requirements. GMC 6X6 trucks that formed the backbone of Red Ball Express operations were specifically designed for military use, but incorporated reliability features, parts, standardization, and maintenance simplicity that reflected decades of civilian automotive development. Radio communication systems enabled real-time coordination of convoy movements across hundreds of miles, while standardized loading procedures and cargo handling equipment maximized the efficiency of supply transfer operations at both origin and destination points. The strategic doctrine implications of Red Ball Express success extended far beyond World War II, to influence American military thinking about the relationship between logistics and combat effectiveness throughout the Cold War period and beyond. Military planners recognized that future conflicts would require the ability to project power across global distances while maintaining technological forces that consumed enormous quantities of fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and specialized equipment. The success of World War II logistics operations provided confidence that American industrial capacity and organizational expertise could meet these challenges if properly prepared and employed, but also revealed the enormous costs and complexity of sustaining modern military forces in extended operations. The mathematical calculations underlying Red Ball Express operations revealed the staggering scale of resources required to sustain modern military forces during intensive combat operations, with tonnage requirements that exceeded the total economic production of many entire nations during peacetime conditions. American forces in Europe were consuming over 20,000 tons of supplies daily during peak operations, including fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, spare parts, and replacement equipment that had to be transported from manufacturing facilities in the United States across thousands of miles of ocean and hostile territory. The successful delivery of these quantities demonstrated organizational capabilities that impressed Allied observers and dismayed German analysts who recognized the implications of such sustained logistical effectiveness. The economic impact of Red Ball Express operations on American civilian society was enormous, requiring conversion of automotive production facilities, mobilization of transportation workers, and redirection of raw materials from consumer goods to military equipment on scales that transformed the entire national economy. The success of this mobilization demonstrated the advantages of having developed industrial infrastructure and skilled workforce that could be rapidly adapted to military requirements without the lengthy preparation periods required by less developed economies. This industrial flexibility represented a strategic advantage that would prove decisive not only during World War II, but also during subsequent Cold War competition with nations that lacked comparable economic capabilities. The organizational innovations developed to manage Red Ball Express operations included new approaches to personnel management, vehicle maintenance, traffic control, and supply distribution that would influence civilian logistics and transportation systems for decades after the war ended. Military logistics specialists developed techniques for managing large fleets of vehicles, coordinating complex supply chains, and maintaining operational effectiveness under adverse conditions that provided valuable expertise for post-war economic development. These innovations contributed to American advantages in commercial aviation, interstate highway construction, containerized shipping, and other civilian applications that utilized military logistics experience. The international influence of Red Ball Express success extended to allied nations that observed American logistics capabilities and recognized the need to develop similar organizational competencies for their own military forces and national economies. European allies began studying American supply methods and attempting to incorporate similar approaches into their own military organizations, while neutral nations recognized that future national security would depend on industrial capacity and logistics capabilities rather than traditional military factors like fortifications or standing armies. The demonstration of American organizational superiority influenced post-war alliance structures and economic relationships throughout the Western world. The lessons learned from Red Ball Express operations contributed to post-war development of civilian logistics systems that would revolutionize commercial transportation, retail distribution, and international trade throughout the latter half of the 20th century. The principles of coordinated supply chains, standardized procedures, and systematic quality control that enabled military success provided foundations for civilian applications that created enormous economic advantages for American businesses competing in global markets. The integration of transportation, communications, and management systems pioneered during World War II became standard practices in industries ranging from retail sales to manufacturing that relied on efficient distribution of goods and services to maintain competitive advantages. The profound irony of America's deadliest weapon in the European theater was that it possessed no armor, fired no ammunition, and carried no crew trained in the arts of war. Yet the humble GMC truck of the Red Ball Express proved more decisive than any tank, more devastating than any bomber, and more feared by German commanders than any piece of advanced military technology. In a conflict characterized by sophisticated radar systems, jet aircraft, guided missiles, and atomic weapons, victory ultimately depended on the unglamorous work of truck drivers who hauled fuel and ammunition through French rain and German flak to keep American forces moving forward when traditional logistics would have forced them to halt and consolidate their gains. The human dimension of this logistical miracle transcended the mechanical aspects of moving tonnages and meeting delivery schedules to encompass the courage, dedication, and professional competence of men who transformed themselves from civilian workers into military specialists capable of operating under the most demanding conditions imaginable. African-American drivers who faced discrimination in their own army proved their worth through performance under fire, while mechanics, dispatchers, and supply clerks demonstrated that victory in modern warfare required the coordinated efforts of thousands of individuals whose contributions were often invisible to casual observers, but absolutely essential for strategic success. The strategic implications of Red Ball Express operations revealed fundamental truths about industrial warfare that would influence military thinking for generations beyond World War II, establishing logistics as a decisive factor rather than merely a support function in determining the outcomes of major conflicts between technological powers. The ability to sustain complex military operations across global distances while maintaining forces that consumed enormous quantities of specialized equipment and supplies, became recognized as a form of national power that could be more important than traditional measures of military strength based on numbers of soldiers or advanced weapon systems. The legacy of the Red Ball Express continues to resonate through American military doctrine and civilian logistics systems that reflect lessons learned during those crucial 81 days when trucks became weapons and drivers became warriors in the struggle for democratic values against totalitarian oppression. The sight of endless convoys moving across the French countryside demonstrated that America's greatest strength lay not in any single advanced technology, but in the organizational capability to coordinate the efforts of millions of individuals working toward common objectives with unprecedented efficiency and determination. Sometimes the deadliest weapons are not made of steel and fire, but of rubber and determination, rolling forward on wheels that carry the future itself toward victory. If you want more untold stories of World War II, subscribe now to WW2 Secret Archives, where history's darkest secrets are revealed.